Welcome back to the 6Ps podcast, where today's episode is going to focus on the creative SAC, in particular, the statement of intention that goes with your creative response. We're going to be looking at the Golden Age, as well as foreign soil, with our examples for this. In terms of the VCAR rubric, it's the one down the very bottom, and you can break it down into three sections. The first one is the justification of decisions related to selected content and the approach made during the creative response. So here we're pretty much wanting to look at justification or explanation behind the decisions that you've made. And you'll see it goes from having a limited justification to having a really insightful justification. So having really strong knowledge of the text is going to be really important. The second part asks you to make solid connections to the original text. And for me, particularly characters and settings and themes are a really good way to do this, as well as sort of symbols and language features. And that last one is an understanding of the purpose, the audience, and in fact, the context. So you do have the opportunity to either add or adapt to the original text. My feeling has always been that adding to the text is sort of less risky than adapting. But if you are going to take that risk and adapt, you've got this statement of intention to really help you. Speaking of suggestions, a bit of a suggested structure we're going to run through today. For me, I like the first paragraph to be really an overview of your intention. Talk about your idea. Provide an overview of the intention of your piece and the underlying ideas from the novel you chose to explore. Introduce the author's style and an overview of the aspects of the text that you found intriguing as a brief introduction to your piece. For me, think about a character, a theme, or a setting. What inspired you to write your particular piece? And use maybe a quotation or two to really delineate the inspiration behind your idea. What was the actual quote? What was a specific quotation that really said to you, yes, I'm going to write on this character, I'm going to write on this setting, I'm going to explore this particular theme. Let's have a look at a sample. This is in relation to The Golden Age by Joan London. Joan London's The Golden Age places heavy emphasis on character development, delivering a unique, close third-person style. This produces characters which feel realistic by placing the reader directly into the character's perception, making them empathise with the character. I wanted to replicate this in my own piece as it was effective in her writing. While experimenting with London's voice, I connected with the themes of isolation, hope, belonging and youth, and wanted to explore them in my writing. Then they get into their idea. And they say, I chose to write my story on Frank as the final chapter in New York, introduced many ideas which London didn't explore in enough detail. I was inspired by London's short passages which shifted Frank's perspective from present-day New York to 1950s Perth. Quote, his voice returns Frank to the back lanes in North Perth. Quote, he was overtaken by memories of the Golden Age. This concept inspired the basis of my piece. I was motivated by London's introduction of Edie into Frank's life, who gives him company in his routine life of solitude. I based Edie upon the unique presence of Elsa. I sought to convey the light these characters share in Frank's life, and London's decision to have the final chapter told through an elderly Frank's perspective intrigued me and gave me the opportunity to explore the themes I was interested in. Here in this sample, we see that the student wants to really focus on a couple of themes. Again, you don't need to list all of the themes. Maybe one or two might be really useful. They really wanted to focus on Frank, and they wanted to, adapt the final chapter, and they wanted to write their own version of that and introduce this character of Edie and provide her with a little bit more depth. You've also can see in this case there are two quotations that they have selected as the basis behind their inspiration. And again, nice and easy, just tell us why you chose this idea, what inspired you to do so. Following that, again, based on the criteria, it's all about your writing now and exploring the decisions behind your writing. So, from paragraph 2 onwards, and it's up to you how many paragraphs you want to write. Again, consider the word limit. That's sort of going to shape how much you write. But look at writing style and techniques. Discuss the author's style, the language, and the structure, and the techniques you used. Quoting her, in this case Joan London or Maxine Beneva Clark, or whoever it is you've written on, as well as your own piece. So think about what the author writes or how the author writes, think about how you write and quote them and explain why that's the case. And critically discuss what the author achieved with her style and how you tried to emulate this in your writing and what effect this achieved. Use technical language and examples, be brief and direct, but show a complex understanding and application of her style and techniques. Now, you are not required to discuss all of the following, but select those that apply to your piece and your process. So in this case, you might discuss similes and metaphors, personification, informal language, colloquial language, context, symbols, the perspective you've chosen, vignettes and flashbacks, varied sentence lengths, page breaks, characters, and themes. Now, this works particularly well with foreign soil and the Golden Age, but you might find it's a little bit trickier to do, say, if you're doing a film or a graphic novel. In that case, you're really going to be focusing more so on the characters and the themes as a basis, and perhaps a little bit about the language that the character uses. So if you're doing a creative piece on, say, Rear Window, and you're writing on Stella's perspective, you might use similar language to her in whatever text type you sort of use, be it a monologue, be it a letter, be it a conversation with her husband, Miles. Again, you can't write about all of these, so select a couple because we know you just don't have the time or the words to be able to do so. So let's have a look at a sample of the same piece on the Golden Age and how they discussed some of their language features. London's use of similes and metaphors allows her to further paint a situation by relating it to something familiar, like letting go of a hand jumping off the highboard. Once you've done it, you were never afraid again. I replicated this by including them to give deeper meaning or context to Frank's situation, helping construct imagery in my piece. This student could possibly have quoted their own simile or metaphor here as well. The next one, I noticed London's methods of introducing and concluding chapters, typically starting with context, painting vivid imagery of the surrounding and setting. She concludes almost on a cliffhanger, leaving the reader to ponder the events taking place in the chapter and wanting more. Quote, polio had taken his legs, but given him his vocation, a poet. I mirrored this by opening by painting a vivid picture of Frank waking up from his sleep, and closing by not tying everything together, but by leaving the reader to their own interpretation of what could happen next. I'm going to assume here there's no quotes from their own piece because they're running out of words. The final one. When reading Frank's poetry, I recognised how London would use little structure to reflect how he is an amateur poet. I wanted to show development of Frank's poetry later in his life by replicating how London wrote poetry from an advanced writer's perspective. Sullivan. I analysed his poems, which typically followed a symmetrical syllable structure. Overnight. It must have snowed. This is all I can see now. I attempted to recreate her style by following a 5-6-5-6 structure when constructing my poem. Again, this is just a snapshot of what this student has written. They go in and provide more examples of their language used. And again, once, just to underscore, we know that you can't possibly write about everything. So if you are over the word limit, it might be an idea, rather than cutting down specific examples, more so cut down on the language features or stylistic features that you've decided to mimic. Now, with your expression, firstly, writing in first person is absolutely acceptable. That's fine for you to do that. Obviously, in our essays, we're definitely not going to be doing that. We're going to be writing in third person, but first person here is okay, so enjoy that. Make sure you embed quotations from the original text as well as your own. I felt the previous sample we looked at could have done with more quotations from their own piece, and again, I'm going to assume that the word limit was the issue there. Include these important verbs when discussing language features. So mimic or mimicking, notice that mimicking has a K in it as well. Emulate, echo, and mirror work really well. And don't forget, of course, your connectives and your comparative terms as well. So similarly to London, or in a similar way, or in the same way, or in a similar fashion. Again, we want to see connections between the author and your own piece. And lastly, remember to explain the reasoning and purpose behind your decisions. Answer the why. Don't just tell me that you've used similes and metaphors. Explain why the author used them and why you've used them in your own piece. And explore maybe a bit behind the workshopping of those particular examples too, about how you came to use those specific terms or phrases. So what are the key takeouts for our statement of intention in our Creative SAC? The first one, as I mentioned before, is to explain the reasoning behind your decisions and to embed quotations where necessary. Remember that you can't possibly explore everything or every decision that you've made, so be selective. And remember to employ key verbs and vocabulary, and of course, as always, proofread before your submission. Thanks for your company once again today. We look forward to seeing you next time on the 6Ps podcast.